Welcome to the Deep Dive. Yesterday, April 28th, 2025. Well, it saw a really significant event unfold. A major power outage right across the Iberian Peninsula. We're talking Spain, Portugal, even parts of France.
Yeah, millions of people affected.
Millions suddenly without power. And the repercussions, based on what our sources are saying, they just rippled through daily life.
Indeed. I mean, the picture our sources paint is one of pretty widespread disruption.
Right.
Just imagine transportation networks basically season up. You had trains canceled. The Madrid metro actually had to be evacuated. Then there's telecommunications going dark. ATMs, well, they became useless bricks.
Can you imagine? No cap.
Exactly. And even some airports faced difficulties. You know, the cancellation of the Madrid Open tennis tournament. That gives you a sense of the scale.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
And tragically, at least 5 deaths were reported in Spain. Plus, essential services like hospitals, emergency responders, they ran into severe challenges. This wasn't just, an inconvenience.
No, absolutely not. Real consequences.
Definitely.
And this wasn't a quick flicker either, was it? Some places were out for, what, over 10 hours?
Over 10 hours in some spots, yeah. And in Spain, it took nearly a full 23 hours for the system to get completely back to normal.
Almost a whole day. What's really striking, though, is that initially, nobody seemed to know why this sudden, 60% drop in power?
60%, yeah. And the grid disconnected from France.
And the cause.
Yeah.
Just unknown.
Yeah.
Which, of course, leads to speculation.
Oh, inevitably. And like we often see in these crisis situations, misinformation spread, well, like wildfire.
Right. What were people saying?
Our sources detail rumors flying around about a Russian cyber attack. Some were even falsely attributing these claims to, like, CNN and the European Commission president.
Seriously?
Yeah. And there were other unfounded claims involving the Portuguese electricity company, EDP Group.
Okay.
And then there was this initial report that RN, the Portuguese grid operator, was suggesting a rare atmospheric event
I saw that one.
causing synchronization failures. They later denied saying that specifically, or at least clarified it. But it just shows how quickly unverified stuff circulates.
Definitely. It really underscores, how vulnerable our information systems are during events like this. Just adds to the anxiety.
For sure.
So our mission today really is to cut through all that noise.
Right.
We want to dig into what our sources suggest might be the actual potential causes for this blackout. And grasp the true impact and maybe put it in the bigger context of, grid vulnerability and resilience.
Sounds good.
Where do we start?
Okay, let's unpack the immediate aftermath. What were the first official lines? Cyberattack was mentioned?
Yeah, that was definitely the first big fear, the cyber attack angle. But authorities in both Spain and Portugal, including the former Portuguese PM, they were pretty quick to say, there's no evidence for that.
Okay, so they shut that down early.
Relatively early, yes. What's really interesting, though, is that initial idea from Aaron, the Portuguese operator, this rare atmospheric phenomenon.
Right, or induce atmospheric vibration. I think I saw that phrase.
Exactly. The theory was that maybe temperature fluctuations caused physical faults in the Spanish high-voltage lines.
Physical faults? How?
Well, leading to a chain reaction across both countries. The idea, as some experts explain it, is that these lines could physically oscillate, like vibrate.
Vibrate, like guitar strings.
Sort of, yeah. Temperature shifts, wind, the line's own properties, maybe causing them to vibrate unusually.
Okay.
And these vibrations could then, theoretically, change their electrical characteristics or just trigger protective systems to disconnect them, like an electrical shutter going through the system.
Huh. That sounds unusual.
It does, and it probably cropped up because the outage was so sudden and widespread, it pointed towards maybe a single external trigger.
But did the weather actually back this up? Because Spain's meteorological agency had something to say, didn't they?
They did, and that's a pretty crucial point. They reported that their data showed no unusual weather, no strange atmospheric events, no sudden temperature changes around the time the blackout hit.
So that kind of pours cold water on the atmospheric vibration theory.
It significantly undermines it, yeah. Doesn't seem likely to be the main cause based on that.
Okay, so if it wasn't some weird weather thing, what other technical explanations are on the table? What else could cause such a massive failure?
Well, our sources point to a few more, let's say, conventional technical possibilities.
Like what?
Things like, okay, maybe some extreme weather that was very localized or just wasn't picked up by the main monitoring, or straightforward equipment failure at a key point in the grid.
A substation blowing or something?
Could be. Or maybe a loss of synchronization, different parts of the grid falling out of step, leading to instability.
Right.
And then there's always, unfortunately, the possibility of human error in operating such a complex system.
True.
Plus, the issue of grid redundancy, or rather, a lack of it. Not enough backup paths for the power if one part fails. That's often a factor.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how these grids are all linked up? Spain, Portugal, France,
Yeah.
the whole European grid.
It is. And it's usually a strength. Well, yeah, interconnection generally boosts reliability. You can share power, back each other up if there's a local problem, but
That's a but?
there's a but. As we saw here, that same connection can let problems spread incredibly fast, like a domino effect across borders. The sources specifically mention a possible incident involving an interconnector, one of the big power lines, between France and Spain. That might have been the initial tripwire, disconnecting Spain from the wider European system.
So it's a double-edged sword, this interconnection.
Very much so. Enhances stability usually, but carries risk if something big goes wrong.
Which brings us back to that core challenge.
Yeah.
Keeping the grid balanced. It's not like you could just store tons of electricity easily, right?
Exactly. That's the constant tightrope walk for grid operators, matching generation with consumption second by second.
Because we don't have giant batteries everywhere.
Not on the scale needed, no.
Right.
So supply and demand have to be almost perfectly balanced, always. If you get a massive sudden disruption like that 60% drop in supply,
And the system can just collapse.
very quickly, yeah, leading to a blackout.
Okay, now this is where things seem to get a bit more debated, perhaps. The role of renewable energy in all this. What are the different takes we're seeing in the sources?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting perspectives cropping up, and they don't entirely align.
Yeah.
One idea, and this apparently came from a social media post mentioned in an article, suggested a massive overload, like too much solar power suddenly hitting the grid all at once.
Wait, a surge of clean energy causing a blackout. That sounds wrong.
It sounds paradoxical, I know, but the idea is maybe the grid couldn't handle such a sudden spike in production.
Okay. What's the other angle?
Another expert pointed towards the high percentage of renewables online at the time, reportedly around 66% from solar and wind.
Right.
And the key concept here is something called inertia.
Inertia, like in physics.
Exactly like in physics. Traditional power plants, think nuclear, coal, gas. They use big, heavy spinning turbines and generators. That spinning mass has physical inertia, and it acts like a shock absorber for the grid's frequency. It helps keep things stable if there's a sudden change, like a power line tripping.
Right. It resists changes.
Precisely. But renewables like solar PV and wind turbines, they connect to the grid through power electronics, inverters. They don't have that same large rotating mass, so they provide much less inertia.
I see. So if you have a lot of renewables online, the grid has less of this stabilizing inertia.
That's the point being made. Less inertia means the grid frequency can swing much more wildly and rapidly when there's a disturbance, like losing that connection to France or a big generator tripping offline.
And what's the consequence of that?
Well, in this case, the argument goes that low inertia might have made it harder for the Iberian grid to absorb the initial shock. It could have contributed to those unstable frequency oscillations and led to it becoming electrically islanded.
Islanded, meaning cut off.
Yeah, disconnected from the main European grid, trying to run on its own but struggling to stay stable.
But is it fair to just blame renewables?
Yeah.
I thought I saw another expert suggesting maybe that's not the whole story.
That's a really important counterpoint. Yes, another expert highlighted that while low inertia likely played a role in how the system reacted, it doesn't necessarily mean it was the root cause. They suggested we shouldn't overlook potentially more fundamental design issues or maybe operational problems within the grid itself.
So the lack of inertia might have made things worse, but wasn't necessarily the thing that started the fire.
Could be. It might have exacerbated the problem, made the blackout wider or recovery harder, but the initial trigger could lie elsewhere. It's complex.
Definitely sounds complex. Lots of moving parts. Now, adding another layer, one of our sources, a Morningstar analysis, brings up something else. Underinvestment in the Spanish grid.
Yes, that's a significant point they raise.
How might that fit into this picture?
The Morningstar analysis argues that Spain hasn't invested as much in upgrading and maintaining its grid compared to many other Western European countries.
Really? Even with all the renewables being added?
Especially considering the surge in renewables capacity, yes. They suggest the grid infrastructure hasn't kept pace.
Why? What's the reason given?
They point to poor regulation, specifically mentioning a lack of automatic adjustments for inflation and low allowed rates of return for the grid operator. Basically, less financial incentive to invest heavily in long-term upgrades.
So you potentially have an older, less robust grid trying to handle a rapidly changing energy mix.
That's the implication. An underinvested grid could just be inherently more vulnerable to any kind of disturbance, whatever the initial cause, and slower to recover.
And who pays for the blackout ultimately?
Well, the analysis notes that Redea, the Spanish grid operator, will likely recover the costs linked to the blackout eventually, probably through consumer bills down the line.
Right. Stepping back a bit, this whole event really touches on bigger issues too, like climate change and its impact on our infrastructure.
Absolutely. It's a huge backdrop to all of this. The European power sector is pushing hard for carbon neutrality, which is vital. But our sources stress we also need to focus just as hard on adapting the grid to the climate change that's already happening and the extreme weather that's becoming more common.
So it's not just about cutting emissions mitigation, but also preparing for the effects adaptation.
Exactly. They're two sides of the same coin. And the links between climate change and grid problems are pretty direct.
How so?
Well, think about it. Rising temperatures can make thermal power plants less efficient. Wildfire smoke can drastically cut solar panel output.
Right.
Stronger storms can shut down wind turbines or physically damage power lines and towers. Even heat waves strain the grid, reducing capacity and causing equipment like transformers to overheat.
It feels like a vicious cycle waiting to happen. Climate change makes outages more likely.
And outages could potentially hinder the transition to clean energy if the grid isn't reliable enough to support it.
So failing to adapt makes mitigation harder, and maybe vice versa.
Precisely. The sources emphasize how interconnected they are. Investing in a resilient grid isn't just about preventing blackouts today. It's essential for electrifying transport and heating, and for handling all that variable renewable energy effectively tomorrow.
Has the EU recognized this? Are there regulations?
Yes, the EU does have regulations aimed at strengthening grid resilience and preparing for electricity crises, whether they're caused by extreme weather or, say, cyber attacks.
Ah, yes, the cyber threat. That always seems to loom in the background with critical infrastructure. Was it a serious consideration here beyond those initial dismissed rumors?
It's always a serious consideration, generally speaking. The risk to energy infrastructure is growing, and the EU is definitely working on protecting against it.
What makes the energy sector so vulnerable?
Several things. It needs to operate in real time, 247. Problems can cascade quickly across interconnected systems that we discussed. And you've got the challenge of integrating older, maybe less secure legacy systems with new digital tech.
A complex cybersecurity puzzle.
Very much so. So while a cyber attack was ruled out for this specific blackout, the overall threat landscape means it's a constant focus for grid operators and governments. Ensuring resilience against both physical threats, like weather, and cyber threats is key.
It's useful to remember, too, that big blackouts have happened before. Do the sources draw any parallels or lessons from past events?
They do. The 2003 Northeast blackout in North America often comes up.
Right, I remember that one. Huge impact.
Massive, and ultimately preventable. It came down to a mix of factors, monitoring systems failing, but also a simple physical issue. A power line sagging into a tree that hadn't been trimmed properly.
Oh, wow, a tree.
Yeah. The key takeaways from that and others are often about coordination and information sharing. Weather and operational issues are common culprits historically. Better coordination helps maintain reliability.
Any other examples?
Hurricane Sandy in 2012 is mentioned too. That was more about direct physical damage, flooding, downed trees, causing widespread, long-lasting outages. It really forced a rethink of infrastructure design in coastal areas, considering sea level rise.
It brings it all back to the human impact, doesn't it? These aren't just technical failures. They dramatically affect people's lives.
Oh, profoundly. Our sources paint a vivid picture of that during the Siberian blackout.
Like the firefighters in Madrid.
Exactly. Overwhelmed with calls to rescue people stuck in elevators, health services saw spikes in calls for respiratory issues, anxiety attacks.
Understandable.
Travelers stranded at stations, airports, mobile networks patchy, ATMs useless. Even basic stuff becomes hard.
And things we don't even think about, like water supply in cities relying on electric pumps.
Potentially, yes. Water, heating, even security systems like electric locks, suddenly they're all concerns when the power is out for an extended period.
It really hammers home our dependence on electricity.
Absolutely. We're incredibly reliant on a stable, constant supply.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, What are the main things to take away from the April 2025 Iberian Peninsula blackout?
Well, first, it was clearly a major event with serious consequences. Second, the precise cause still seems to be under investigation, really. That initial atmospheric idea looks unlikely now.
Right.
More probable factors seem to be a mix. The way European grids are interconnected, potential underinvestment in Spain's grid making it less robust, and the complex role of renewables, especially that grid inertia aspect.
And the ever-present background noise of the cyber threat, even if it wasn't the cause here.
Exactly. It's always a factor to consider in grid security.
And I guess this whole episode just really highlights how vital resilient energy infrastructure is, especially with climate change bringing more extreme weather and other threats out there.
Couldn't agree more. It underlines the need for ongoing smart investment in modernizing our grids. We need better coordination, better planning, better ways to mitigate the impact when things do go wrong.
Because our reliance on electricity isn't going down, is it?
Quite the opposite. It's only increasing as we electrify more of society.
So maybe the final thought for everyone listening is, considering how much we all depend on electricity every single day, what vulnerabilities might exist right here in our own local grids? And maybe what questions should we be asking? Asking our energy providers, our policymakers, to make sure we have a power supply that's reliable and secure enough for the future.
That's a really good question to leave people with. Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining me to unpack all of this.
My pleasure.